This is House Planning Help episode 397. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Mark Lynn, Managing Director of Eden Renewable Innovations. We're going to focus on sheep's wool insulation today, but we'll start by looking at the wider category of natural fibre insulation. Mark is also a founding director and chair of the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. This is a great organisation that we've name-dropped a fair few times on this podcast and will continue to do because they're always promoting healthy, low-carbon products, which I hope is what you're trying to use on your project, or as much as possible. We've covered all sorts of topics that would interest them as well, reducing plastics, reuse, and today's topic of natural fibre insulation. And we'll work into the show notes today some of the other interviews that we've done over the years with Simon Corby, CEO, Catherine Adams, the technical director's been on. We've even nicked a couple of their keynote speakers from the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo, which is a great conference. We'll link that in as well. So Emily Penn talked about plastics a few years ago. We've had John Palmer on explaining how building regulations are made. Then Nature Plus, this is another great way of identifying what is a sustainable building product. Nature Plus has its own eco-label. So we spoke to Tilman Kramulish. Chris Brookman was on. He's a member of the ASBP. We got Dr. James Glocklin, who we featured recently, and he's the author of the Mass Timber Insurance Playbook. So quite a bit of work went into that and just trying to be a useful resource. And any others we find in the archive, we're going to work in today. So that's the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. Let's get to my conversation with Mark Lynn, Managing Director of Eden Renewable Innovations, which is a natural fibre insulation company, probably best known for their Thermofleece sheep's wool insulation brand. So there are two parts to this interview. Firstly, we'll talk about natural fibre insulation in general, and then we'll focus on sheep's wool insulation specifically. I started by asking Mark how long he's been working in this area.
I've been in natural fibre insulation for over 20 years, and prior to that, I was in timber preservation. So I'm a chemist with a background in material protection. So there's quite a strong link between the science and sustainability of timber and the chemistry of timber and natural fibre insulation. So it was a good transition from one to the other.
Well, that's what we're going to focus on today, natural fibre insulation, and then take a deep dive into sheep's wool. Yeah. But if we're looking at the category to begin with, what do we mean by natural fibre?
Well, natural fibre insulation is any building insulation that's made from or using natural fibres. So typically sheep's wool, wood fibre, hemp, jute, sisal, cotton, flax, and then cellulose, which is essentially recycled newspaper, which obviously is derived from timber. So any of those in isolation or in combination, really.
And why would we choose that over, say, a synthetic insulation?
It's funny you say that because we're very familiar with natural materials in construction. So if you look at timber, for example, timber is the most widely used material for pitched roofs, ceiling joists, doors. So we're very familiar with natural materials in construction, and it naturally follows then that we should be looking at natural materials for other aspects within the built environment, including insulation. And there are certain benefits that natural fibres bring that other materials don't. And in particular, the way that natural materials deal with moisture. Because as I'm sure you're aware, heat and humidity are interconnected.
So you've opened the topic there of moisture. What are we talking about? Do they all deal with moisture differently?
Essentially, the chemistry is the same, and the chemical backbone of a natural fibre has certain electrical charges at the molecular level, without getting too scientific about it. But that electrical charge distribution on the backbone of the natural fibre attracts individual water molecules that are able to stick to the backbone like little magnets. And that's really important because when the water molecules adhere to the natural fibre the way they do, they can't behave like a liquid. And it's a liquid water that's a universal solvent that promotes life and reactions. So if the moisture can be held in a solid form, then it really adds a sort of extra dimension to the material that only natural fibres within the context of insulation can really do. Now, all natural fibres perform that function to a greater or lesser degree. It just depends on the material. So sheep's wool is made from a super tough protein called keratin. You're probably familiar with it. It's the same protein that your hair is made from or nails. And that is very efficient at this process of absorbing and releasing moisture. And then timber would be made up typically of cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin, which again chemically does the same thing, but with a different molecular structure, if you like, and a slightly different porosity.
And when we're talking houses, we know there's moisture in the air, we create moisture. Can all these insulations cope with the moisture that we have if we start drying clothes, or does it get to the point where they are waterlogged and stop performing? How would it work?
Well, that's an interesting point, because what we can't do is confuse the sort of moisture buffering capacity that I've just discussed with ventilation. So when we're talking about, true breathability within the building fabric, it's a combination of ventilation. It's a combination of the ability of the fabric itself to buffer moisture during periods of high humidity. So in the scenario you've just talked about, when someone's drying clothes in a room, then ventilation is the number one principal mechanism, apart from not drying your clothes inside in the first place, but that's difficult for people. Ventilation is the number one thing that you need to consider. That's a really important point to get across, because I think there's a misconception that when we're talking about breathability, that somehow it's a substitute for ventilation, but it's not. It's in addition to ventilation. So, if you're looking for the best performing buildings and building fabric when it comes to moisture, have a combination of a truly breathable building fabric and very good ventilation strategy. And when I talk about truly breathable, there's two components to that. You've got the vapor openness, which is the ability of water as a gas, so water vapor is a gas in the air, for that gas to pass through the material. That's what we describe as vapor openness. But then the moisture buffering capacity that you get with a natural fibre just adds a bit more to that. So again, what we're talking about here is the accumulation of gains, if you like. So you've got good ventilation, you've got an appropriate vapor openness and an appropriate moisture buffering capacity. So when you work all those things in the right combination, the natural fibre shouldn't get saturated, and what it should do is work as an effective buffer as humidity fluctuates.
Now, I'm imagining that a key part of this is getting the design right in the first place. So how do we go about that?
Well, the thing about insulation or any building is good design, good workmanship, good materials. So the one thing that we do and that we can do, depending on the nature of the design, but there's sophisticated software that can look at the climatic conditions, the different materials, their properties, and then it can determine the risks of interstitial condensation within the building fabric, because it's really important with the natural fibre, as it is when it comes to moisture with all building materials, that we do an appropriate analysis. Again, it's not sufficient to say, well, the natural fibre can buffer some moisture, therefore we don't need to do that. Actually, you do. It's really important that we get the design elements right, and critically, that those design elements are translated into actual building fabric through proper workmanship. So it's all connected.
So you don't get the scenario that people just come straight to you saying, I want a load of insulation. There you go, there it is.
Well, you've seen enough in the press about what happens when insulation goes wrong. And even at the basic level of insulating your loft, regardless of what materials you use, you have to take some fairly straightforward precautions. And in particular is to maintain ventilation in the loft space. Because, again, a DIY enthusiast could just go in the loft and they think they're doing the right thing by sticking a load of insulation in the ventilation spaces in a loft. But those ventilation spaces are there for a reason, and it's to dissipate any moisture that moves up through the building fabric. So, having the right workmanship at all levels is really important.
What do we need to think about then when it comes to installing this? You mentioned that good workmanship. So what will affect the performance?
Well, we've got to make sure that when we're designing insulation, particularly when we're looking at old buildings, we might think it's a good idea to block up all the drafts, if you like. So we might insulate internally and then block up all those drafts that are causing us a problem with the comfort, which is fine. But you have to realise that those drafts are actually serving a purpose in terms of inadvertent ventilation. So you've got to substitute that with managed ventilation. So making sure that there's appropriate vapour control within the building fabric. So again, having a breathable material isn't an excuse for not having adequate vapour control. And what I mean by adequate vapour control is, for example, in the winter, when we've got warm, humid air in the inside and it's cold and dry on the outside, is making sure that we're not overloading the building fabric by a lot of that hot, humid air moving into the building fabric. And in an extreme situation like that, you might have a lower risk of condensation with a natural fibre, but you're not going to eliminate it. So it's important to get the building fabric designed and set up so that you're not overloading any one point with excessively high humidity, which then is going to result in condensation. Now, there's a much greater margin for error with that, with the natural fibre, but you still need to design your build-up properly and to model and calculate the risks accordingly.
And what different forms does the insulation come in, and how does that then translate to installation?
Well, there's three broad types of natural fibre insulation. So you would have what's called flexible insulation. So that would be an equivalent to a fiberglass that you'd be familiar with. And that has got a little bit of bounce to it, if you like. And it usually comes in slab form. But also when it comes to sheep's wool, we produce a roll as well. That's one advantage of sheep's wool. You can roll it quite easily. And that is generally used as a substitute for a rock wool type insulation. And then you've got rigid wood fibre, which is where you have the wood fibre that's bound into a sort of medium density wood board, if you like, and that can be put over the rafter, it can be put against the wall. So, it wouldn't be a direct substitute for a phenolic, those phenolic foam boards, but you can use it in similar situations. And then you have what's called loose fill, which is where you have a loose fibre, typically recycled newspaper with a fire retardant or fine wood fibres with a fire retardant. And what happens is that they're blown into a void. So typically in a timber frame, you would have maybe a racking board and a membrane on the inside, and you would blow the fibre in there under pressure, and that compacts the loose fibre into the void. And the advantage of that is particularly if you've got very complex spaces, it sort of fills all the nooks and crannies quite effectively. And the loose fibre, the material itself is a lower cost material. Depending on the type of construction, it can be more economic to blow the fibre into cassettes and what have you.
Why do you pick one natural fibre over another?
Well, I wouldn't, you see, because the whole point here is to use the best of all resources. So it's not a question of selecting wood or wool or hemp or jute or cellulose. It's all of the above, because, if you take wool, for example, we use UK coarse wool. It's a very specific kind of wool. there's enough of that wool in the UK to insulate about 30, maybe 40,000 properties a year, if we were going full tilt. What about the other 500,000 properties or whatever that need to be insulated? And similar with everything else, we can't be too territorial about it. And this is one thing that we do within the ASBP. So we formed the Natural Fibre Insulation Group, which is all the main natural fibre insulation brands in the UK. And we're very collegiate, and we take the approach that we're going to promote the category, principally because none of us at this stage are big enough to do it all ourselves. So we muck in. We've produced an introduction to natural fibre insulation guide, which is available on the ASBP website, and a series of briefing information sheets, again, so that we're all talking in a consistent language and we're getting the benefit across. Quite often, when it comes to what insulation does someone choose, quite often it'll come down to something as simple as what they intuitively are connected to or what story they like. So someone's building a timber frame and they may want to use wood throughout the whole build. Similarly, they may have build a timber frame and they've got just a traditional loft, and the easiest product to put in a loft from a workmanship point of view is sheep's wool. So again, it could be a combination of the above, really. But the key point there is that we've got to use the right type of the right resource in the right way, and that really involves a whole mix of materials.
Is there growth in the natural fibre insulation market?
Yes, there is. I mean, I've been involved for over 20 years, so I've seen a few false starts. And I think the reason for that, we're going back a number of years really, is that natural fibres were being sold purely on the basis of being eco. And that's not enough really for, to make enough people make a purchase. So one of the things that we did with the Natural Fibre Insulation Group was explain that insulation does many things, and that we've really got to be making people more aware of the functional aspects of the product. Because there's a reason why there's so much timber used in housing, and it's because it's the most appropriate functional material for those particular end uses. So, what's happened, particularly since COVID, because when COVID happened, people had a lot of time in their hands and they did a lot more research and seemed to have more say in what it is they were going to put into their property, and that stuck. So we've certainly since COVID, we've seen very strong growth in the category, and that is showing no signs of diminishing. And if you look at, where we need to get to, if you take our sort of neighbours in France and Germany, natural fibre insulation represents about 10 to 15% of the whole insulation market. In the UK, it's maybe 1%. So, the ambition from natural fibre point of view, obviously there's a lot of people that want, everyone to be using natural fibres, but if we can be sort of realistic about it in the short term at least, what natural fibre insulation should be is a credible part of the mix. So if we're looking at, say, Germany and France, it's about 10 to 15%. There's probably more than 10 to 15% of properties in the UK that could benefit from natural fibre insulation. But if natural fibre insulation grows to about that size, then it's a credible part of the mix. And that's really good for the client, for the householder, because it means that they've got greater choice. Because what's important is that you're using the right materials in the right way for each individual building. If natural fibres are the best choice for a lot of properties, but a lot of householders aren't being given that choice, then they're being sold short a little bit.
Let's talk about some more of the benefits that you might get. So we talked moisture. What else might we be considering?
When it comes to heat, there's two aspects to insulation performance. One that is the one that we're all familiar with, which is energy loss and therefore reducing your energy bills. And that's clearly very important for people. But then we've also got the heat gain. So particularly in parts of the southeast of England, where in the summertime, you're getting a lot of heat penetrating the property now. And that's something within our business that we're receiving increasing amounts of inquiries about. So what you want really is to manage the degree to which that heat during the peak periods of the day can penetrate the property, because I'm sure everyone's been in a situation where you've been in a house which just sort of feels like your blood's boiling really, because there's just so much heat accumulating within the building fabric. Now, what natural fibres insulation does, because of its thermal mass, and its thermal mass really is down to two things. One is the ability of the material itself to absorb energy without increasing its temperature, and natural fibres are at least twice as good. In the case of glass, maybe 3 or 4 times better than a synthetic material. And also the density, because the higher the density, the higher the amount of material. And when it comes to this sort of heat buffering, natural fibres are in a bit of a Goldilocks zone, in that they're capable of absorbing the heat during the peak parts of the day and then slowly releasing it later in the day. That's essentially called phase shift. So what you're doing is, there's a normal heat cycle in a building where it should get much hotter inside during the peak heat and colder at night. And what you're doing with the natural fibre insulation is shifting that phase so that the heat gain and the heat loss are completely out of sync with each other as much as possible. And without going into the technical details, that's 12 hours. So we're trying to shift the phase across 12 hours in a 24-hour day. And natural fibres are particularly good at that.
And we often think natural fibres healthy, but how does that manifest itself?
Well, there's a few factors to that. One is the insulation itself acting as a source of pollutants. So, for example, formaldehyde is a very... maybe not so much in the UK, but you travel outside the UK and you'll realise that formaldehyde is big news when it comes to indoor air quality. And rightly so, because it's a carcinogen, it causes a lot of problems with upper respiratory tract. You would know the smell of formaldehyde if you came across it, because it smells a bit vinegary. So what natural fibre is good at is they're very low source materials. So if you're looking at the actual building material itself acting as a source of pollutants, then natural fibres are a good choice. In addition to that, again, indoor air quality is linked to moisture. It doesn't take much for mould, for example, to develop within the building fabric. So if you're keeping humidity at a more controlled level, then you're going to improve indoor air quality and the negative health effects of microbial activity such as mold growth. So the material itself, in a source control strategy, trying to choose materials that don't emit pollutants, and then also choosing materials that are going to help with a better moisture balance within the building fabric, which again has a knock-on effect on health. And again, these are things that are well documented.
Acoustics?
So acoustics, natural fibre insulation would be broadly as good, if not better, than a very good quality sort of rock type insulation. So if you take our Thermofleece Ultra Wool as an example, that would have the same acoustic performance as something like an RW45 rock wool, which is a bit of a go-to acoustic material. Now, that's got a density of 45 kilos a cubic metre. Our Ultra Wool has a density of 32. So we're actually achieving the same level of sound absorption, but at 2/3 of the density. Wood fibre, wood flex is a good example, because you can manufacture a higher density wood flex. That performs extremely well as well.
And what about fire risk? How do these materials function in that respect?
Well, all the natural fibre insulation would contain a mineral fire retardant, which promotes charring. Wood naturally chars anyway. So you've got a reaction to fire that doesn't act in an accelerating way. So the insulation itself wouldn't contribute to the developmental stages of a fire. They're not classed as non-combustible, so where non-combustible insulation is mandated, you would have to use an insulation with that rating. But for all the applications for which natural fibre is specified, which there are many, it's fire safe and it meets with the requirements of Part B of the building regulations. And all the natural fibre insulation suppliers, as you would expect, test their products to ensure that they do meet the requirements of the building regulations for the end uses that they're specified in.
So are there ever any challenges getting these signed off with building control?
Not from our experience. I've got a technical team. I'm very close to other natural fibre insulation suppliers, and all of them have very competent technical support teams that, their job really, or part of their job, is to work hand in hand with an architect or a client to get these projects through building control. If you think that Thermofleece has been around for 25 years, wood fibre in the UK has been around for longer than that. So we're talking about over a generation's worth of use. So by now, most building control departments or building control officers are familiar with these products. I suppose the challenge is that people can come with misconceptions about them and maybe assuming that they're okay for certain applications if you're into, eco design, or if you're in a traditional building. That might sway their opinion to some degree, but it doesn't mean that they don't sign them off. You'll get some building control officers that maybe are less familiar, but generally speaking, they're providing that they're given the correct information. We don't see a problem with it.
Does this come down to cost then? Is there a big cost differential between natural fibres and mineral or synthetic?
Well, it depends what you compare against. So the tendency is for people to compare the cost to a fiberglass loft roll. Well, if you do that, that's like going into a shop and comparing the price of everything to a penny chew. So if you look at something like a phenolic foam board, that's a costly piece of material, but people are willing to pay the premium for that because it gives them a benefit that they understand, which is that they can get a lower U value with a thinner fabric. Similar with certain foil products, good quality rock wool isn't cheap. So there's plenty of experience in the insulation market of end users, clients, whoever, willing to pay money for insulation, providing they understand the benefit that it gives them. In terms of cost, if you're comparing natural fibre to performance insulation, if you like, then the cost we're not orders of magnitude more expensive. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about insulation, you're talking about something that by definition pays for itself. So what I would say is, how can something that pays for itself be expensive?
Are there any other barriers that people very keen to go down the natural fibre route, but for one reason or another are forced to look at the alternatives? Are there common things that might happen that we should be aware of?
Well, I think if we look at the entire construction industry, people are very set in their ways. So it can be difficult if you're speaking with a professional to sort of move beyond that. What I would suggest is that you contact a manufacturer, because if you go on the ASBP website, there's a natural fibre insulation group, and every one of the companies on that will have a technical department that they can help provide information to. There's a lot of juvenile behaviour in the construction industry as a whole, so quite often the products will be sort of dismissed in a sort of jokey kind of way, which is a bit annoying. I think maybe an increased modicum of maturity across the board might just help a little bit, because these are serious products with a serious track record across a large number of markets, and they deserve to be taken seriously. So if you're a client or an end user and you're asking someone's advice and they just dismiss these things, you've got to question why they're doing that.
Are there any other important aspects to the category as a whole?
I think what we're doing as a group is the right thing at the minute, which is promoting the category as a whole. Because if we start talking in different language and saying that one fibre is better than another, in a lot of ways, we're sort of cannibalizing our own market. What we are doing, and what we should do, is focus on our growing the pie. And that's something that is snowballing. And the definition of snowballing is that you reach a critical mass where you suddenly realise the snowball's quite big. And if you take Germany as an example, I know we've talked about France, but how natural fibre insulation got to the size it is in Germany wasn't driven by this piece of legislation or that. It was just driven by consistent growth over a long number of years, and that growth rate being higher than the market. So we're sort of at that stage at the minute. We're probably 10 years behind, or maybe more, behind some of our European neighbours, but we're on that journey where the growth is outstripping the growth of the market, and eventually that reaches a critical mass. And when you're at that critical mass, then you've got more money to promote, to do things that grow the market even more. So we're well on the journey to that critical mass. But it is re-educate or an education piece still. We get contacted by dozens of people every week, and although our brand's Thermofleece has been around for 25 years, the people that are making contact with us are on a voyage of their own discovery. So they're coming across a lot of these things for the first time. And the thing that we try and do is try and excite them in that voyage of discovery. And the more that can happen, the better, really.
Just one final question on the group as a whole. Are quite a lot of these natural fibres almost waste streams?
Well, wood fibre would be a byproduct of sawmilling. The wool that we use is the coarse dark wool, which isn't really suitable for any other application. So that's certainly a waste material. Something like cotton would be generally there's bit of post-consumer denim waste is typically what's used. With other natural fibres such as hemp and flax, then that's a virgin material. So the fibres that are used in hemp or flax insulation would be part of the crop. So you've got other components of the hemp plant that would be used for other end uses, and the fibre would be part of the crop. But there's other reasons for using those fibres other than the fact that they're a waste. They're not a waste.
Let's now use the next section of the interview to talk about sheep's wool and how you got into this. It sounds like you've been with this for quite some time, so maybe just you could tell us that story.
I used to work in biocides, funnily enough, and I left that industry because I got very unwell, and I don't know what caused it, but there may have been a connection there. And I had a lot of experience of natural materials, and I was sort of working on my own for a couple of years, and I came across the business that owned Thermofleece and that had created Thermofleece, and there was just a good natural fit. And I started doing some work with the founder, Christine, and we gelled together, and that was a long time ago, and we've been on a journey of highs and lows and growing the market, and I'm still here. We're still here. Because we believe that we're producing a really good product, and we've got a great team of people that are committed to what they do. And I'm glad I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 20 years, which is sort of trying to grow a healthier, more sustainable built environment than what I was doing before.
And we're talking wool, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I've been to shearing sessions at farms in the past, and from what I understand, actually sometimes it can be quite a challenge for them to dispose of wool. So does that make a nice fit to begin with, if that's correct?
Yeah, I mean, people think of, and why wouldn't you? You just see sheep on the field and think they're all the same, they're white and fluffy, but in actual fact, there's many different breeds of sheep, and those sheep produce all sorts of types of wool. So, for example, you'll get a very fine light wool that'll tend to be used in clothing. Because it's light, it can take a dye consistently. So if you want to dye the wool a certain colour, it'll be a consistent colour, and it's fine, so it can be on the skin. And then you've got coarse light wool, which is generally used in carpets, so it can take a dye consistently, but it's very hard wearing. But then you get other sheep breeds where the wool is very inconsistent colour, usually dark, and it's very coarse. And so it doesn't have a lot of end uses. Now, those sheep are bred for a reason, and that's for the meat. And the wool is essentially a waste byproduct. We buy that in the auctions. We don't pay as much for that wool as potentially the farmer would like, but we buy it for the price that it's for sale in the auction, given that there's not that much demand for it outside insulation. But what we do as a business is that we add value to the rural economy nonetheless, because we create jobs. We're based in the Lake District National Park. We create jobs, and we take that wool, and there's a lot of cost added to it, by the way, which is why the final cost of the insulation doesn't necessarily reflect the auction price of the wool. But, you know, we create a good product. We're buying a reasonable proportion of the UK wool clip. We could probably buy 5 or 6 times more, but we need the demand for that, obviously, and linked to the stuff we've previously talked about. But we have a good, successful rural business. We're adding value to the rural economy, so it seems to work.
And what is the product? You've talked about these different types of wool. Is it all wool?
No, so when you make flexible natural fibre insulation, you have to bind the fibres. They need to be held together with something, because if you look at, say, a loft under a time-lapse camera, every time a lorry drives past, every time there's a gust of wind, every time someone slams a door, everything moves. So if you've got a system of loose fibres where everything moves, generally it's going to collapse. So you need something to hold the fibres together. So we use a polyester bicomponent binder that we mix with the wool itself, and that creates longevity, which is good. We're talking earlier about locking that carbon up. So if we can then produce a natural fibre insulation like sheep's wool, same with wood flex or hemp, whatever, and we can leave that in the loft and it's there for 60 plus years, the benefit of having a bound fibre outweighs the benefit of having something that's maybe 100% but doesn't last as long. It's difficult when it comes to wool because, you know, we're accustomed to 100% wool being a mark of quality when it comes to clothing, for instance, but it doesn't quite follow from our experience with wool. So we bind it. We put a bit of recycled polyester in with it as well, and that gives us a real springability, if you like, so we can compress pack the insulation, and that has a big bearing on the impact from factory gate to site, and it reduces the packaging substantially, both in terms of the packaging weight and the amount of packaging we use. Now, obviously, if you have something that's not 100% natural, then at the end of life, you wouldn't be looking to compost the product, but that would apply to a lot of natural flex insulation. But there's plenty of other end uses for it. It's a mixed textile. It can be reprocessed back into natural fibre insulation. That's technically possible, but that's really dependent on the sort of geographical dilution of the waste, if you like. But the good thing about wool waste is it can be used as, you know, at the end of life as a sort of mixed textile end uses, such as underlay and other things.
And what are the proportions then, say, of wool versus the polyester?
So we work with a blend of 75% wool and 25%, which gives us a really good ratio because it enables us to optimize the density. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to produce a product that's cost effective. So, you know, our sheep's wool rolls particularly are a very cost effective product, surprisingly so. So if we can reduce the amount of material per square metre and not reduce our thermal performance, then it's taken a broadly resource efficient approach. So that recycled polyester that we use comes from recycled plastic bottles. So would you prefer that was put in your loft and out of circulation for 60 years, or perpetually recycled into another plastic bottle that you probably didn't need in the first place? And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the PET that we use is an excuse for consuming virgin PET, but there's a mountain of it and it's got to go somewhere. Similarly, the polyester that's in Thermoflace, it's not polyester that's in some clothing that's getting washed out of the drain of your washing machine every time you wash your clothes. So, and the other thing is, of course, that we get verified EPDs for all these products. So people are free to look at the information themselves and make their own judgment. I'm not trying to sell everything to everyone. If it's not right for someone, then that's fair enough.
This is also true in that general group, certainly for things like wood fibre can have a glue, can't it, that keeps it together? And
yeah, I mean, flexible natural wood flex or hemp or most of the others really would use the same bi-component binder. Dry foam wood fibre would have a binder in it. You need a binder, and we shouldn't be shy about that. You know, we are looking at alternatives, but they have their own complexities and their own impacts, and this stuff isn't necessarily straightforward. What I can say for certain is that the product that we manufacture is the best version of sheep's wool insulation that we can come up with at this moment in time. And a lot of properties are benefiting from the sustainability aspect of that, but also, as we talked earlier, the functional aspects of it. And as technology changes, then, you know, obviously our products change.
yeah, I think that's the same in the whole vanguard of green building. So pest control then, when we're doing this processing, I mean, does it even need pest control, or is this an important step?
Well, the one thing that wool is susceptible to is clothes moths. I mean, it's well documented, so it's very important that if you're using wool insulation, that it is protected against attack by moths. And what we do is we apply a borate fire retardant at the final stage of when the wool's getting washed, and then each fibre it gets treated with the borate, and the borate means that we don't then have to add specific insecticides or anything to the wool. And that's very effective. I've been working with that stuff going back many years, and it works. But for certain, if you're going to manufacture wool insulation, you've got to get it right, you know. And there have been instances in the past, you know, it's part of the early development of the category where things maybe didn't go as well as they should have done. But you know, they're experiences that people have built on. So at this juncture, really, that, you know, if people are supplying a brand of sheep's wool insulation in the market, you know, it's incumbent on them to make sure it's properly protected.
And you mentioned earlier about the different types of insulation and that there were 3 categories. Does yours fall into just one category? Or?
Well, we would be the flex. And the advantage of wool over any other natural fibre is it can be rolled very easily. So if you're looking at, you know, a lot of our business would be what people would understand to be a standard loft insulation. And there's a lot of people that just don't want to use fiberglass. And the one thing, when you think about it, if you look at all those natural fibres we've talked about, there is only one of those fibres that has evolved through nature to be an insulator, and that's wool. Everything else has to be modified to a greater or lesser degree to become a useful fibre. And I'm not being disparaging by saying that, but you know, you have to take a raw material and then produce a fibre from it. Wool is the fibre, and nature's created it. And what that means is that people have a natural sort of affinity to wool, and they get that sense of comfort. I mean, there's an awful lot of properties where people use a wool carpet. You know, if you're installing a wool carpet in the house, why wouldn't you install wool in your loft? Probably the principal reason why more people don't install wool in their loft has nothing to do with wool. It's the fact that they stick their head up through the loft hatch and just see the decades worth of stuff they've got in their loft, and they can't face moving it.
And do we want this insulation, when it's in a loft scenario, to not be compressed to you know, how would it be installed in a loft?
You would just simply just put a layer between the ceiling joists and a layer over. I mean, funnily enough, if you compress the insulation, you actually improve its thermal performance as a material. But obviously you create a thinner layer of it, and therefore the overall U value increases. But to meet building regulations for an existing building, you would put about 240 mil, so 100 mil between the joists and 140 over. And that would be the case whether you were using sheep's wool or hemp or wood fibre, really. The advantage of the Thermofleece Cozy Wool roll, at least, is it's a roll, so you're not putting loads of different slabs over the top, so it can be quite time efficient, and installers like that.
What is the U value, and does that change between products?
Well, the thermal conductivity of of our products are sort of 035 to 039. So it sort of compares to Rockwool, really. And that would be the same for all natural fibres. I don't think anyone's got below 0.035. But what's interesting, really, if you're looking at certain applications, maybe if we're looking at existing buildings, on a solid wall, for example, you don't need that much insulation to have a very beneficial effect. So we've become accustomed to just thinking about U values, but in actual fact, in a retrofit situation, we should be thinking about energy savings. So energy savings are just the energy that we're losing by not insulating the wall compared to the energy savings that if we insulated the wall. And when you do that, you don't need very much insulation to have a massive impact. So, for example, the U value of an uninsulated brick wall is about 2. Even if you put 50 mil of insulation against that wall, you're dropping the U value from 2 down to about 0.6. So you've got a huge saving in energy. So it's by far and away worth doing something rather than nothing. And of course, when we're talking about moisture earlier, having that thinner layer of insulation means that the interface between the insulation and the wall, it doesn't get too cold. And then it further reduces the risk of any issues with moisture, which are further reduced by the fact that you've got a natural fibre, which are further reduced by the fact that because you're using a natural fibre, you're being a little bit more sophisticated about vapour control. So you're producing quite a safe system there where you're losing 70% less energy than you were to start with, and you're only using 50 mil of or maybe 70 mil of insulation, which again, when we were talking earlier about the cost, there's a big difference between 140 mil of something and 50 mil of something. So I think when it comes to those hard to treat properties, which are maybe the floor space isn't significant, it's trying to get that message across that you don't have to do too much in terms of insulation depth to get a real positive impact. But what you've got to do is make sure whatever is installed well.
Any other pros and cons that you'd like to mention about sheep's wool?
Lots of pros. It's a natural fibre that people can connect to. It's very easy to use. I don't want to go on the sales pitch for sheep's wool. In terms of cons, I think it really just boils down to what value you see in stuff. So people that see that it's worth spending a bit more on something will be more inclined to spend it. I think the biggest con is the fact that people store too much stuff in their loft before they insulate it. So I think if the government had a grant scheme for people clearing their lofts out, there would be more people insulating their lofts than a grant scheme for insulating your loft, if you know what I mean.
That was one of the things that I really enjoyed when I built my house, was having loft that is just loft. Nothing gets put up there.
Yeah, exactly. yeah.
How are we doing then on cost for Thermofleece?
People want a very pithy answer to the issue of cost, but typically you could insulate a loft with Thermofleece for under £1,000 and it would pay for itself within 5 years. So by my book, that's not expensive, but by other people's it might be. Getting back to what we said before, if we can appeal to that, in the first instance, to that 15% of the market that are inclined to use the materials, then, they understand value. I think when I was studying business, that was the big thing in marketing, wasn't it? You sell value, you don't sell cost. That's what we're trying to do.
Is there anything else you would like to bring into the conversation or to wrap up in a particular way, either on sheep's wool insulation or the bigger topic?
What I would urge anyone is not to dismiss natural fibre insulation before you start on the basis of cost, because it's not cost prohibitive in many, many cases. And the other thing is really that these products have been around for a very long time and are tried and tested. I mean, I think wood fibre insulation was around when my granny was at school. It's been around that long. If you take cellulose insulation, believe it or not, is nearly a quarter of the entire insulation market in the USA. So these aren't sort of quirky eco products. They're part of the insulation mix.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session houseplanninghelp.com/397. We've got a summary waiting for you there, so you can work your way through that and check out the key points once again. We've got some photos. And of course, if you've got a comment or a question, we'll give you links to get interactive on social media. We'll link you to Mark, we'll link you to Eden Renewable Innovations, all at houseplanninghelp.com/397. Let's finish up with a quick mention for Regen Media, which is my video production company. And if you've got a project that you've just finished and you're really pleased with the results, don't just move on to your next project. This is a great opportunity to pause momentarily, make a video that says everything that you want to say, how life has been improved by this building. What's different about it? Has it used lots of natural materials? Is it very high performance? Well, let's celebrate all of those things. And a case study is such a good way of doing it. It doesn't have to be really expensive. There are all sorts of different formats and ways that we can film it just to make it interesting or make it follow exactly what you're after. So get in touch. We want to line up lots more videos. I always think my job here is to try and promote the good work that is going on. So houseplanninghelp.com/video if you want to find out more. That's as far as we go for today. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media. Content that matters.